going to continue our series on how to effectively study the Bible. And I want to kind of look over the next couple of months at the different sections of Scripture. Tonight we're just going to be looking at the first 5 books of the Bible, but not really at them. And the goal of the message is not to explain them, but to explain an approach to reading them and helping you see how that approach is so important to fully understanding it. So let's just read the first 9 verses of Exodus 23. Let's look at that. Thou shalt not raise a false report. Put not thy hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil, neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many, to wrest judgment, or to pull judgment away. The idea of wresting is like wrestle something away. Neither shalt thou countenance a poor man in his cause. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you will surely bring it back to him again. If you see the donkey of him that hates you lying under his burden, and would forbear to help him, then you will surely help with him. You will not wrest the judgment of your poor in his cause. Keep you far from a false matter, that the innocent and righteous slay thou not, for I will not justify the wicked. And you will take no gift, for the gift blindeth the wise and perverts the words of the righteous. Also, thou shalt not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of a stranger, seeing you were strangers in the land of Egypt. The TV series, The West Wing, ran from 1999 to 2006. And it highlighted the professional lives of presidential advisors to a fictional Democratic president named Josiah Bartlett, played by Martin Sheen. Some of you know who he is. He's a pretty well-known actor. I don't think I've ever seen an episode of The West Wing. I don't know really anything about it. Some people say it's pretty intriguing. I don't know. I've never seen it, but it was critically acclaimed, winning multiple awards for primetime drama series. The demographic for the show, interestingly enough, was primarily high-income households. So if you watch this regularly, this must mean you've been hiding your wealth really well from the rest of us. The creator of the show is a man named Aaron Sorkin. And I don't know if you've ever heard that name before. He's a pretty well-known playwright and screenwriter who's developed or collaborated on a very well-known television series and movies. He's been nominated for 3 Academy Awards. Before I go into a scene on the TV hit series The West Wing, I want to give you some background on Aaron Sorkin. Mr. Sorkin let it be known early in his life that he views all religions as equally good and bad, with no religion as morally superior or ethically superior to another. In an interview with NPR, he said, quote, "I'm Jewish, but have never had any religious training." And then he went on to explain that when he was 13, all of his friends were being bar mitzvahed. And all he saw was first that they were learning a lot about the Old Testament, which he thought was kind of interesting. In fact, he kind of saw it almost in what he does now. He saw it as kind of a drama unfolding and you playing a part in reading parts of that drama and then being showered with gifts. And so he called a rabbi in New York and said, "Would you be able to help me be bar mitzvahed in the next 6 weeks? Can you teach me the Old Testament?" To which the rabbi said to him, "There's no way you can do this in 6 weeks." But his cavalier approach to Judaism and religion in general undergirds an apparent hatred for God. And I really mean that. Aaron Sorkin hates God. In particular, one particularly appalling burst of blasphemy, Sorkin has his main character, this Democratic president, Josiah Bartlett, in a Catholic church complaining because of the death of his friend to a drunk driver. Here's the quote, and I can't read the full quote for you because there's a lot of profanity in the quote, but here's what he says. She bought her first new car and you hit her with a drunk driver. What? Was that supposed to be funny? I think you're just vindictive. Later, in the same sentence, he says that God is, a, quote, a feckless thug, end quote. He says, quote, am I supposed to believe those were the acts of a loving God? He had just blamed God for all sorts of disasters. He says, are you a just God and a wise God? And he says all of this in Latin, by the way, at this point. So unless you know Latin, you're probably not able to follow. But at the end of his Latin phrase, he actually damns God to hell. With that in mind, I'm then led to a YouTube clip that's been seen about 1.4 million times. And actually, I saw this clip shortly after it aired because somebody sent it to me. And this was a long time ago. So I don't know how I got a copy of it. Maybe it was a reference. Somebody referenced it to me. But it's a scene in which Martin Sheen, the main character, walks into a room and one of his secretaries says, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States, and everybody stands. That's protocol, except one woman who is a character who was designed to represent Laura Schlesinger. And I don't know if you remember who Laura Schlesinger was. Some of you are just looking at me going, I have no idea who you're talking about. She called herself Dr. Laura. She was really popular right at the beginning of this century, kind of the end of the 1990s into the early 21st century. And she has a PhD in physiology, but called herself Dr. Laura and dispensed social, psychological type advice. I will tell you, I listened to Dr. Laura when she was on the air. She's actually been off the regular radio since 2010. She's in syndication. I think she's on Sirius XM radio. I guess I could listen to her because my car has Sirius XM. I haven't listened to her in years. I found her advice to be off-putting. She would regularly just kind of yell at people, and her advice would always, she would say one thing, and it sounded really good, but then the next day she would contradict herself by giving the exact opposite advice to somebody else. She had no real moral center like the Bible to go off of. In fact, she converted to Judaism at one point in her life, and then left Judaism because all the Jewish people, she said, ganged up on her. So this is Dr. Laura. Well, this character is in this scene. And the president notices that she's not standing, and he's trying to talk, and it bothers him. And you understand that Dr. Laura was second in popularity to Rush Limbaugh at the time. Rush was basically number one on the radio for 30 years or so, up to the point of his death last February. He was number one, and then number two was Dr. Laura into 2010. And this character is not standing, and it's kind of bothering the president while he's talking. And so finally he stops and he addresses her. And this is the way Aaron Sorkin sets up his lines. I've been reading a lot about this man actually in the last few weeks. But Sorkin uses people like this as straw men to knock them down easily. He comes from a family of attorneys. Apparently he's really bright, very intelligent. And he knocks down Dr. Laura, this character, not a Dr. Laura, but a Dr. Laura type character, by addressing her Judaism and attacking the Old Testament. So here's what he says. This is really interesting. I want you to listen to this. This was on an award-winning television program. Listen to what he says. I'm interested in selling my youngest daughter into slavery as sanctioned in Exodus 21:7. What would a good price for her be? Then he says, my chief of staff, and he insists on working on the Sabbath. Exodus 35:2 says that he should be put to death. Am I morally obligated to kill him myself, or should I call the police? Here's one that's really important. We have a lot of sports fans in this town. Touching the skin of a dead pig makes one unclean. Exodus 11:7. If they promise to wear gloves, can the Washington Redskins play football? Does the whole town really have to be together to stone my brother John for planting crops side by side? And then he just goes on a little bit, and then, he obviously has the room. Everybody's laughing. And if you go under the comment section, by the way, on this YouTube video that's seen about 1.4 million times, you'll find me there because I actually started commenting with somebody about this. But if you have somebody who has no real understanding of the Bible, these things throw them. They do. They throw you. Particularly when you get to the Old Testament Pentateuch, the first 5 books. I mean, there's a lot of really dark stuff there. Really dark. Really awful. I mean, when you read Genesis, you have God creating everything perfect. By chapter 3, everything has completely fallen apart. And then you have basically, 8 chapters to Noah, 5 more chapters to Noah. God destroys the world. And then 2 or 3 chapters you get to Abraham. And then it's not really better. It's pretty awful. But you read the Old Testament like this fictional character does, like Aaron Sorkin does, and you have trouble understanding it, and it really does throw people. If you get into discussions with people who are secular, who have some religious training or know something about the Old Testament, they can be quick to say things like, can you explain the Old Testament genocides? You say, genocide? Well, sure. When God said to kill the entire race of the Amalekites, what else do you call that? But that's genocide. Or what happens when the children of Israel actually enter into Canaan and they begin cleansing the land of all of those wicked people, the Hittites and the Hivites and the Jebusites and all of the others that are there, the Buzzites. Those are my favorite, the Buzzites. But he's wiping these people off of the earth. And then you say, so is this a loving God? And then liberal theologians will say, really what's going on here is you have an Old Testament God who's different from the New Testament God. The Old Testament God's very hateful and vengeful, and the New Testament God is really the good, loving God that you see in Jesus. But all of this is kind of being presented in our secular world as being true. But it leads me to ask you the question, so how do you read those things? How do you read them? And I want to give you first maybe a little formula for how you approach the Old Testament law. And then we're going to look at the passage I just gave you to help you see why Sorkin's approach is wrong. And really maybe if explained to him, he might have a better feeling about the Old Testament. So would you consider with me first, understanding the law is based on 2 fundamental concepts. First, the law cannot be embraced without a love for God. So Deuteronomy 6:5, and I think probably I'll start putting D6:5 on a lot of our church stuff. Kind of look to see that, because as things start coming out, you're going to see a little D6:5. This is really kind of a life idea concept. You will love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and might. If you don't love God, you're never going to be able to read the Old Testament rightly. You're never going to be able to understand what God is doing because you're always going to be criticizing what He's doing. The law can't be embraced without this love for God. Jesus, by the way, calls this what? He says, when the lawyer says, how can I have eternal life? What does the law say? And the lawyer says back to him, love the Lord your God. He's quoting Deuteronomy 6. And then he says the second's likened to it. Love your neighbor as yourself. We'll look at that in a moment. But here the emphasis is on this greatest commandment, that if God is the highest being, then loving Him is the very best thing that His creation can do. If there is no being greater than God, then loving Him is our highest aspiration. Can I say it that way? It is the thing that we really should drive us, motivate us, control us. And it's the basis of our worship. This is why it undergirds the moral law. Well, how does the moral law begin, right? How does the 10 Commandments begin? Well, have no other gods before me. Okay. But how does it actually begin? I am the Lord your God. I am your God. I brought you out of Egypt. Now, here's what I want you to do. Have no other gods before me. Don't make any graven images. And you go down through those 10 Commandments. So this Lord, this God, understanding and loving Him is really the basis by which we approach the Old Testament law. In fact, it's greatest in its scope. Loving God is a complete thing. You can't love God with only part of you. It has to be complete. I love God with all my heart. I love God with all my soul and with my might, my strength, my physicality. Do you understand, friends, what he's saying here? What Moses is writing down for Israel is this. Undergirding the approach to the law must be a complete and total love for him, or you'll never get it. You'll never understand it. Which is why I don't actually get angry with what Sorkin wrote. I actually feel a little pity for him, right? And he's not the only one in Hollywood, by the way, who's that like this. I feel a pity for a lot of them. They just don't know God. And that's why they're the way they are. Now, my argument here is that without a Deuteronomy 6:5 approach to the law, none of it can be understood or applied to the life. So loving God with my heart, soul, and might means believing God's law is the highest expression of his goodness to man. Think about that. It's the highest expression. So I say God's wisdom is greater than my wisdom. So because I love him, I will look at those things, those commands he gave, and I will accept them for myself. And I even see them as intent for my benefit. God didn't write them just to harm me. God doesn't tell the Jews not to eat pigs, and it really is the greatest of God's creatures. It really is. At least as far as I know right now. I mean, I'd give you a second dibs on lobster or crab, but it's right there. 1 and 1A. But they couldn't eat lobster and crab either. God didn't tell them that to punish them. Those dietary restrictions, all those things, you have to approach them and say, what is God doing? Well, I don't know exactly. Maybe that's how you read it. I don't know exactly what God's doing, but I love him. And I know that because I love him with all my heart, soul, and might, regardless of why he's saying what he's saying, I know that I will do it gladly because I love him. That's where everything begins. This is why Hollywood, in general, can't understand this. Because these have already committed the fact that they don't love God at all. And that's why their approach to God limits what they can understand of him. And you find this all through Scripture, actually. The Old Testament says this in various places, that people are spiritually blind. It talks about it in the Psalms. You read it in Isaiah. Jesus mentions it. Paul mentions it in a couple of places, that people are blinded. Consider 1 Corinthians chapter 2, the inability of the natural man to receive the things of the spirit that are of the Spirit of God, because they are spiritually discerned. So even if you can understand the words of Scripture better than others, the spiritual meaning that's there will have no real impact on your life. There was a woman named Etta Linnemann. She was a German theologian, wrote a bunch of commentaries, one on Proverbs that I understand is really good, and is now with the Lord, actually. But she was a liberal theologian, did not know God, had no relationship with him, but wrote commentaries. She trained to be a theologian and wrote commentaries, very liberal commentaries. And one day a missionary in Germany is going door to door just through the community, knocks on her door, has no idea the person he's speaking to, this woman, knows more about the Bible than he does. There are liberal theologians who know a lot more about the Bible than some of us, right? I mean, they are schooled in it, trained in it. But just gives her the gospel. And God opens her heart, and she got saved. And she later said, I wish people would burn all of my books. She could understand the Bible on a grammatical sense, but not really understand it. And if you understand that this is the first piece of this formula, I have to love God with all my heart, my soul, my might, then the second part is pretty simple too, right? Because what's the second part of the law? What's the second command? It cannot be embraced without a love for God. Can I say it cannot be practiced without a love for others? This is the second piece of the formula. Leviticus 19:18 says it. You have to have a love for other people, love your neighbor. And Jesus calls this the second commandment of the law. And I'll tell you this, it's the basis of his golden rule. This is what he gives in Matthew 7, right? I'm going to do unto others as I want them to do to me. I was standing in a Bath and Body Works on Friday morning, and we were buying my mother stuff that apparently my dad doesn't care for, but I was buying it for my mom anyway, uh, and things that smell, and and we were standing there, and by the end we'd purchased all our stuff. We're just kind of standing there, and because of coronavirus, they were limiting the number of people who come in the store, and it crossed my mind, we should leave. Now, I'm sure the people I was with, they weren't saying, I'll just stand here and make those other people stand out in the cold. But it crossed my mind we should leave. And the reason, immediately as I was thinking about that, here's what I did. This is terrible, but I kind of patted myself on the back. Aren't I being good because I'm loving my neighbor as myself? That's kind of what I was thinking. But I actually was thinking that way. I wouldn't want to stand out in the cold, so I'm going to leave so those people can come in. Well, you probably do this more than you think, actually. If you kind of think about it and you go through life, you can probably say, why did I do that? Well, because I want to show love to other people. You can't really practice the law. If you were in Old Testament Israel, you couldn't practice it without actually loving other people. So Leviticus 19:18, Jesus says, is the law and the prophets. All of it is built off of this. Paul's going to say that later. If you want to do the law, you have to love other people. That's in Galatians chapter 5, I believe. Love your neighbor as yourself. By the way, after this story of where the lawyer asks this question, what does he say when Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself? What does the man ask Jesus? Who's my neighbor? And now we get a parable. And what's the parable? It's the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I thought to myself, this lawyer did us no good because now we have a whole bunch of charities named Samaritan this or Samaritan that. Right? But when Jesus points him to the law, the man replies rightly, Deuteronomy 6 and Leviticus 19. And Jesus says, do this and you'll live. And then he says, okay, so who's my neighbor? And the man's point here is, I want to limit this to as few people as possible. But what Jesus actually does is he expands it out to the whole world. My neighbor is the human race. Those are my neighbors. And so my point is, you can't practice the law without loving other people. Now, that's the formula. So as I read the Old Testament, particularly the Old Testament law, even if I don't understand what's going on in that moment, maybe I'm going to have to get a commentary. We talked about all the ways you have to go through to read the Bible. Sometimes you're going to need context. Sometimes you need help. After you've read it in different translations even, and you say, okay, I finally think I understand it. You may not understand it at first, but if you approach it with the formula of saying, I'm not sure I understand all of this, but I know I love God, and I really do want to love other people, then you will be able to understand what God is at least doing there. So let's look then at Exodus 23, because here's a section of the law, and you could pick any section of the law, but here's a section of the law that's going to be helpful to help us, this is point number 2, understand how we should love other people. Here are some ways we love other people. And let me give you 4 ways we love other people from this text. Number 1, love your neighbor through honest testimony. You see this in the first couple of verses. Don't raise a false report. Don't put your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. Don't follow the multitude to do evil. Don't speak in a cause to decline after many to wrestle away judgment. And don't countenance a poor man in his cause. Now, the first thing we notice here is that a legal case requires witnesses. You don't have all the modern techniques to find out who committed a crime. By the way, I am glad for modern techniques. There have been some really awful ways people used to detect criminals. Back in Victorian England, the way they used, the method they used to determine whether you were a criminal or not was the shape of your head. The bumps on your skull determined whether you were a criminal or not. There's actually a whole basis of criminology that was based on that. I don't remember the term off the top of my head, but it sounds insane to us, right? But this is actually what they did. You can imagine the attorney I mean, look at him, Your Honor. Look at his bumpy head. He's clearly guilty. I know he wasn't even in town when this happened, but yes, he's guilty. But multiple witnesses should alleviate the problem of misunderstanding, right? If you have multiple, more than one, stand up and say, this is what I saw, and this is how it should be. But what if the witnesses are liars? You know, this is what Jezebel did to Naboth to steal his vineyard. This is what the Sadducees did to Jesus. So the law states that the witnesses should be honest. And I think actually Moses is understanding the human heart here and says, not only do there have to be witnesses, but you have to be an honest witness. So if you're going to love your neighbor as yourself, you better be honest. This means not misleading the court to let a criminal escape justice for his crimes. That's what verse 1 is saying. Don't let a criminal escape for his crimes. Tell the court the truth. It also says don't follow the mob mentality in their injustice. Boy, you know, there's a lot of modern applications we could make right there, don't you think? And I mean on the right politically and the left politically. You could go both ways. I sometimes laugh because the new Black Panthers are a radical leftist group. And they were talking about the Ahmaud Arbery case. And if we don't get a guilty verdict in this court case, we're going to have an uprising. And the reporter said, what are you going to do? He said, well, we're going to get guns. We're going to train everybody to use guns. And I thought, well, that's just the Second Amendment. What's wrong with that? He was looking at it as an uprising. I thought, that's perfectly fine. And I kind of wish Ahmaud Arbery had a gun so he could have returned fire. Those crazy people who ran him down and shot him to death. But you see, sometimes these groups get so far out politically, they kind of reach around and touch on the other end. They end up crossing over. Well, God says, look, don't follow the mob. The mob may go one way, but you do what's right. They may be wrong. The many might be wrong. They might wish someone harm. Finally, this means not showing favoritism to someone out of sympathy for their situation. And I love the strange wording of the verse. Do you see it there? In verse 3, don't countenance a poor man in his cause. Did you expect that? Don't be in favor of the poor man just because he's poor. That's just human nature. If you see a poor person who's been brought to justice, your heart kind of goes out to that person. He's got a difficult life. But if he committed a crime, then he has to actually pay the price for that. So don't show favoritism to the poor. By the way, there are some scholars who actually mistranslate one of the words here to change the word poor into strong, because they say it can't be poor. It has to be the other way around. So I think the idea is we might be inclined to be sympathetic, but we must follow the law in order for justice to work. So the first idea here is love your neighbor through honest testimony. Now the second idea he gives is also interesting. Love your enemy through helpful assistance. So if you see your enemy's animals wandering off, right? They're wandering off. You should bring it back to them, to this man again. He's your enemy. This is, in verse 4, interesting. So the animals are gotten out of the fence. They're now wandering off. You consider the man to be your enemy. But what should you do? Go back to Matthew 7. What did Jesus say? What's the rule? If I'm going to love my neighbor as myself, I would want, even though he's my enemy, for him to bring my animals back. And that's exactly what he says. Bring it back to him again. Now, it's interesting on a different situation in verse 5 is now, here's not the enemy, but someone you consider to be an enemy. This is someone who considers you to be his enemy. He hates you, right? You may not have bad feelings at him at all, but he hates you, and you come upon his animal, his donkey, his ox, and he had an accident, and he's lying under his burden. So what should you do? Well, if you're able to help him, he says, then you will help him. If you're able to lend assistance, then you should lend assistance. Now, this makes perfect sense, doesn't it? But you say, but wait a minute, he's my enemy. He might be considered to be your enemy, or he might consider you to be his enemy, but he's still your neighbor. And you are commanded to love your neighbor as you love yourself. Now, you could stop and put this into a contemporary application that'd be pretty interesting. Because you're driving down the road, and maybe you were in a situation where somebody really told you off in public. I mean, it was brutal. A lot of swear words, spittle. It was awful. You didn't deserve it. Total misunderstanding. You didn't get a word in. And you turn around and you drive away, and later that day you see the guy over on the side of the road, smoke coming out from underneath, billowing out from underneath the hood of his car. And what do? Maybe it's raining, right? You can make this story go on and on. Maybe he's been in an accident. What do? Well, how would you want to be treated? You don't go by, honk your horn, and wave out the window and laugh. You pull your car over and say, hey, what can I do to help? Right? So you love your enemy through helpful assistance. And then number 3, love the poor through honest judgment. You will not wrestle the judgment of the poor in his cause. So now he's flipped the favoritism argument back to the poor where we would have expected it to be. So instead of showing favoritism for the poor, this is a warning against showing favoritism to the rich just because he's rich. Keep from a false matter, and the innocent and righteous do not kill, or don't slay them. Slay thou not, for I will not justify the wicked. And by the way, don't take a bribe, because that blinds your eyes. So here, this law has been flipped. And how should we not show favoritism for the rich? Don't be involved in deceit that benefits them. Integrity is something every Christian should have. We all should be people of integrity. This is a matter of our testimony, I think. So you shouldn't be involved in a situation where the innocent and righteous are killed or are damaged or harmed because of your lies, which presupposes the possibility that people will be harmed by false testimony, going back to the need for honest witnesses. 2 false witnesses could put a person to death, which is why we need to have integrity. So Moses gives the warning. And I love the warning here. God will not justify the wicked. You know what he's saying? God's watching. Oh, he's watching. Don't take a bribe. He sees your hand out under the table. And the person greasing your palms with filthy lucre. That's a good Bible way for saying money. It blinds justice, twists the course of justice. Then number 4, love foreigners as you would want to be loved. Man, I hesitate to even think about all the contemporary applications we have here. How should we love these people? Well, verse 9, don't oppress a stranger. You know the heart of a stranger. You were strangers in the land of Egypt. Here we have positive actions toward foreign people. And it's interesting how twisted this became by the time of Jesus. Do you stop back and say, were Jews known for loving foreigners? They hated foreigners. So how could that possibly be if right here is enshrined in their law for how they should treat foreign people? They despised them. They were supposed to be a testimony of God to the world, and instead they were incredibly prejudiced. And you go back to thinking of the Samaritans as an example. And Jesus talks to the Samaritan woman, and she's shocked that he does, because the Jews and the Samaritans had no relationship at all. So what were the Jews to do? Not oppress them. Do not afflict or crush them. I love this. What are the ways that people can afflict foreign people in a society? And I don't mean just our society, in any society. How can the people who are there afflict the other people? Well, economic oppression. You don't let them work, can't buy and sell. Legal injustice. You can withhold the levers of justice from them so they can't actually get justice for their cause. There can even be things like job-related discrimination. I'll never forget how angry I became when I learned of redlining. Do you all know what redlining is? Some of you don't know. It's when they wouldn't give loans to black people because they were black. They just wouldn't. Where I grew up, I didn't know this till I was an adult, but apparently all the neighborhoods where I grew up in Greenville, South Carolina, there were on the deed, there were restrictions on the deed that said that you can't sell your property to black people. Can you even imagine that? I can't even fathom a world where that would be the case. But that's exactly what this is. It's exactly what this is talking about. That's injustice. And certainly that would include slavery, the type we had here in the United States. So what we actually have here is the Old Testament equivalent to the Golden Rule. It really is. How should you treat them? He says, let me tell you exactly how you treat them. Like you would want to be treated, because you know how you were treated. So you think, okay, how did the foreign people treat us? Well, they tried to attack us. They wouldn't let us cross through their land. They wouldn't even, we were going to buy water from them. They wouldn't even sell us the water. We really had a rough time with our children and with our livestock. We had to sometimes walk miles out of the way. All of that's in their history. You remember how you were treated. So how should you treat them? With that sweet spirit that you want to be treated. That's how you show love for other people. See, you go back to, it's really quite simple. The formula as you read the Old Testament law is simply this: do I love God and do I love other people? And if I love God and I love other people, really, then these laws are really not that difficult to understand or apply. Because if you don't love God and you don't love your neighbors, then you'll have difficulty in comprehending what God is actually doing here. Can I just say this? We can read the Old Testament law and see the moral and ethical heart of God, even in laws that no longer apply to us. And we can see the benefit of keeping them in Israel. Now, before I conclude, I just want to ask you, do you love God? And do you love other people? Really? Do you? Do you really love your neighbors? Do you really have love for those people who you run into out in the world? Do you love the people at church? We're each other's neighbor as it is. Do you love each other? And do you love God? And if everything starts there, well, you get to the New Testament and Paul builds all sorts of arguments off of these. Because once it starts there, everything kind of falls into place. A well-working machine Christianity becomes as we love him and love others like we love ourselves. Let's close in prayer.